Merry Christmas, everyone. And this may be a bit of a shocking video that I feel like doing today. As everyone knows, I'm Roman Catholic, and I do believe that Jesus is the reason for the season. But I don't feel like doing a straight up review today. So I'm going to be doing more of a comparative video, where I'll be discussing two of the most controversial films ever made about Jesus Christ. First one is from 1988, and it's The Last Temptation of Christ. Second one is from 2004, and it is The Passion of the Christ. Now, which one's better? I have a pretty big bias with this. Easily the better one is The Last Temptation of Christ. Hands down. Now, I do appreciate, I appreciate The Passion of the Christ. Is it a truly great film? I wouldn't say so. But is it bad either? No. The thing that's good about The Last Temptation of Christ is really just about everything. If you're one of those overly religious fanatics, then yeah, The Last Temptation of Christ is not going to be for you. But you got all these theologians and all these religious scholars that actually do think that Last Temptation of Christ is a really good film, and that it explores its ideas very well. Now, I must agree with that. Last Temptation of Christ is a brilliant piece of film. But is Last Temptation of Christ better? I would say that I would just say that it is more accurate to what actually happened. But that's not really saying a whole lot, because because Passion of the Christ only covers just a little bit in Jesus' life, while Last Temptation of Christ is more of it doesn't really show Jesus' entire life, but it's almost like Jesus' time as an adult, like when he was getting his disciples. And it, like a little bit of It's a Wonderful Life thrown in there. So, right now I'm going to get into what the movies are about. So, it's going to be a comparative video, and we're going to talk about the better portions of each film. So let's start off with the older one, which is The Last Temptation of Christ. Willem Dafoe plays Jesus, who thinks that it's more of a burden to be the son of God than something that's great. He's just a guy who happens to be Jesus' son, who happens to be God's son, and everything seems to be more accurate, more realistic to the way that things actually happened. Like when Jesus, he feels fears and he feels doubts among things. He feels temptations, and whenever he's able to overcome things, it's a major victory. And the thing that's great about Last Temptation is, like, okay, Jesus, he has all the greatness, all the good things of God, but he has all the strengths of God, and he has all the flaws of a human. So the way that Martin Scorsese is able to explore this, and the way that he's able to bring Nikos Kazantzakis' book to life, very thrilling stuff. And we'll get to learn so much about why Jesus had to die on the cross and the salvation of everything. And it's just, and okay, I don't want to get too deep into this, because I don't want this video to be super duper long. So let's move on to Passion of the Christ. In Passion of the Christ, Jesus, it's the last 12 hours of his life, starting off with when he's praying in the garden and Judas betrays him. So in in Passion of the Christ, Jesus gets tortured afterwards for 2 hours. It's one of the most gory pictures you'll ever see. One of the most violent films you'll ever see. It's pretty one-dimensional. And when this came out, a lot of people were complaining about anti-Semitism. I can see why. Because it's not just Jesus who happened to be Jewish that he gets tortured throughout the whole film, and it's pretty one-dimensional in that regard. The Jewish people and the Romans that actually do the torturing, they're pretty weird. I mean, take the part when Jesus is getting flogged. Like, they get of course the flogging scene, that's pretty accurate, but they get the blood on their hands, and they're just like really? When this came out, you had people like Christopher Hitchens and David Starrett that were saying that Mel Gibson has a really warped mind. Well, I can see him wanting to make the things accurate, but come on, at least have some other things to it. Let's talk now. So we talked about what the movies are about. One thing that I forgot to say about Last Temptation of Christ is Jesus is on the cross, and forgive me for not mentioning this before. When Jesus is on the cross, he gets to imagine what life is like living life as a regular human. That's what the most iconic portion of the Last Temptation of Christ is all about. I'm sorry I forgot to mention that. But yeah, now let's move on to the acting and the characterizations. No way can you possibly argue that the characterizations in Last Temptation of Christ are inferior to the one in Passion of the Christ. You just can't make that. You just can't compare them to. Jesus, this is okay. Whenever you see lots of movies about Jesus or miniseries about Jesus, he's presented as almost like an egotistical superhero, kind of. But in the case of Last Temptation of Christ, way more multidimensional. Now, nobody knows exactly how Jesus was when he walked the earth, but as I said before, he's presented way more dimensional in the Last Temptation of Christ. He has doubts and he has fears, and when he overcomes them, it's really triumphant. And plus, you got Harvey Keitel in this, and Barbara Hershey, and even Harry Dean Stanton is in this movie for maybe 5 minutes roughly, and he steals the show. Well, he does steal the show. He's a scene stealer. And seeing just all these layers to all these characters, and how well everyone is acted in this, just amazing. Last Temptation of Christ, on the other hand, just about no characterizations. I mean, pretty boy Jim Caviezel plays Jesus and gets tortured for 2 hours. Now, we get to see a little bit of characterizations, but at the same time, it's not really great either. They're okay in Last Temptation of Christ, aside from Jesus. And when we see all that, it's nah. Like, the dude that plays Judas, he's okay. Pontius Pilate isn't too bad. A couple of the Romans in this aren't too bad, but yeah. Now let's talk about let's talk a little bit about the overall meanings of both films. This one. This Last Temptation of Christ had a really huge emotional impact on me because it presented the Bible and well, the New Testament and Jesus in a way that I had never experienced before, which was if Jesus was all man and all God, then he was more of a relatable source, more of a relatable sort of person, and he was able to, and like, if he could overcome things, by golly, we could too. And it was really such a fascinating piece, and of course the acting by Willem Dafoe, oh my god. Whereas with Lost Temptation of Christ, it's people were calling this movie Medieval Saw when it came out because of how gory and how violent it was. And I do agree I do see where they're coming from, but the thing that made Lost Temptation of Christ so good was its sense of spirituality. Lost Temptation of Christ had just about none of it. I say just about because there's maybe 2 minutes worth of non-torturous scenes in this. There are flashbacks, and we when we see Jesus rise from the dead, it's that's also super duper brief. So we get to see Jesus tortured for 2 hours, and the spiritual stuff maybe gets a minute worth. We learn absolutely nothing except for how bad Jesus' last 12 hours were. Last Temptation of Christ, on the other hand, 2 hours and 45 minutes of pure spirituality, and it feels much shorter than 2 hours and 40 minutes. So now let's talk about the experiences of both films. Last Temptation of Christ, come on, Willem Dafoe, Harvey Keitel, and it's directed by Martin Scorsese. Martin Scorsese is a master at this, and he's able to make such a thinker, and he's able to create craft together such an amazing, thought-provoking, stylistic, like everything that I love about films. Martin Scorsese is able to incorporate into Last Temptation of Christ to the very highest degree possible. With Last Temptation of Christ, extremely unpleasant film. I say, I don't want to say that there's no redeeming qualities of it, but if I was an atheist, I would say that, yeah, Last Temptation of Christ, no redeeming qualities about it. The movie is for people, Passion of the Christ is meant specifically for people that already believe that are already religious people, or they already believe that there is a God or in Jesus, and that maybe they are a little bit iffy with going to church and stuff. If you're an atheist, Passion of the Christ will not change you. You'll hate this film because you learn nothing except that the last 12 hours of Jesus' life was agonizing. Last Temptation of Christ, if you're an atheist, you will still find the movie pretty thought-provoking because you'll just see that there's you'll just see all these different notions that maybe you weren't already aware of, and just new notions of things that just make better sense, and you'll also see that this is simply a great piece of film. So yeah, if you like Last Temptation of Christ more in watching this video, that's fine. This isn't really which film is better, even though I just stated a bunch of reasons why I think this one's a much better film. Yeah, this is more of a case of just an appreciation post. Like, you may like, even though Last Temptation of Christ is based on a book from the 1940s or 50s or 60s by Nikos Kazantzakis, still give this one a chance, because it is a good film. So, yep, that's going to be my Christmas Day video. and I hope to see you all shortly.